Hi everybody, this is Professor Engel. I hope you've had a great week of classes at Pueblo Community College. As I promised, I wanted to post some video lectures, some miniature ones if you will, that will just kind of help us make up for some of that specific time we discussed in our first class. And this is the first of several videos I will be posting this semester, and I will be posting them on D2L. Go to the Content tab, and then under the Content tab you will find a new module that says Video Lecture Links. These are all YouTube videos, and you can access them through D2L. I just would remind you that per Pueblo Community College policy, although these are posted on YouTube, they are not to be distributed to others who are outside of the class, and that's a specific school policy. So what I would suggest is get your notes out like a normal class, and what I'll be doing is showing you these slides and then narrating them as we go along. If you have questions, please feel free after you've watched the video to send me a question through D2L, or of course you're welcome to also visit with us in class, and we can go from there. So you can see from the slide there, this is our first discussion of ancient Egypt. And I like to start this particular discussion of ancient Egypt with this poem. This, by the way, was a love poem found on the site of pottery next to the Nile River. And so if you would please take a few moments, read this poem, and then what I will do is kind of help dissect it and break it down and let you see some of the elements of it that are important to our study of ancient Egypt. If you need to, please do feel free to pause the video so you can continue reading this, and then just continue playing when you're ready to hear the discussion. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at this poem here. Obviously, it is a love poem, I'm assuming, by a young Egyptian male who's talking about the love of his life. And some elements of this poem that I think are important to understand would be, one, the references to the Nile River. That's going to be a theme that I'll be talking about here momentarily, because really the Nile River is such a critical part of ancient Egyptian life. I want you to notice the references twice in here to the crocodile. The crocodile hunched on the sands, keeps motionless guard at the crossing. And then here also, my charming girl whispered water magic, and the crocodile sits spellbound. I think those are two elements that we will be discussing as well, and that is the Egyptian, I'm not going to say obsession, but certainly their fascination with and observation of animals and their connection with their polytheistic beliefs. And then, of course, just some other elements here. And really just as an overall reminder, when you are reading poetry, pay attention to those writing clues and prompts that the author has given you. And you should read it really the way the author attempted or wish for you to observe that. And so I like this line in particular here, where he says, "How is it? Desire can soar in the wrench of this current. Rough water be tame as my fields. Why, she loves me, she loves me." And I think what you need to appreciate about that, one, is that it really is about love that even you can, that same emotion that he is experiencing there is an emotion that you and I can experience today in terms of love. And really what that really kind of defines is if you've been in love and you know that kind of goofy, funny feeling that you have, and you might even describe yourself as foolish as a result. But the primary thing that I, again, want to point out in this whole piece is really that observation of that incredible, powerful river, the Nile. And it specifically states here, a whole Nile at flood stage, and it rages between. And that really is an important element, and that takes us to our next slide. This is a fairly modern photograph of the Nile River, and if you look at the notes below, you'll see that it is the longest river of the world. It is 4,130 miles long, and Although I'm not going to suggest that the Nile River of today has the same role as it did in ancient Egypt, it still really is a critical part of what makes Egypt thrive. And if I had to put it in very simplistic terms, this is the lifeblood of the Egyptian people. And there are several reasons for that, and if you'll notice at the bottom of the slide, I put the importance of the Nile. Let me talk about the first one. Obviously, it is a transportation source, not only for goods and people, but I would also suggest that it is a transportation system of ideas. As people move and they take things with them, they're also taking who they are, and they're taking new ideas and concepts with them. You might wonder how the Nile River provides a level of protection. And let me show you on the next slide a map that would give you some idea of why I say the Nile is important. If you see in this political map here, the Nile River's location within the country of Egypt, what you really observe is that it is not certainly in the middle of the nation, but it is away from its neighbor Libya, and it's away from its other waterway here, which would be the Red Sea. If you wish to attack the citizens of ancient Egypt, you either could go down the Nile River, which would be your ideal way to do that, or you could go across the desert. This would be an incredibly difficult task in ancient Egyptian times due to the harsh desert conditions. It just would not be realistic probably to take a massive, large-scale army across that expanse of desert land. The final item here, which is life, and I put in parentheses here, flood, plant, harvest, is really probably the most critical part of that. And let me explain why that is the case. Every June, the banks of the Nile River begin to swell, and the water runs deeper and faster. And eventually, in mid to late June, water will pour over these massive banks here. Now, I'm referring to ancient Egypt, and again, this is a more modern map, but what you'll find is that water will pour and in many cases go miles and miles on both sides of the Nile River. And every October, the floodwaters will recede. What is left behind is what the Egyptians would say is the gods and their multiple gifts to the Egyptian people. Because what is left behind is this wonderfully rich silt, which has so many of these incredible nutrients, which in turn makes it some of the best agricultural land that you could ever imagine in this middle of this great desert. And so when I suggest that flood, plant, harvest really has become their life cycle, it really does mean essentially without that Nile flooding its banks, providing that rich silt where they can grow these beautiful crops and nurture themselves and feed themselves and their families for the remaining year. Without that Nile River, it simply would not be probably a place that you could begin to sustain life for an extended period of time. Now, as we go about our lecture today, you'll see my final notes here about religion and lifestyle. I think you'll find that it really does make itself compatible with life along the Nile River. Let's go to our next slide. Again, here's that political map. This would be a more representative map of what you would see. What I need you to see in this map, at one critical point, Egypt was actually separated, and they were really almost two different countries. This, as the map indicates, is Upper Egypt, this area here, and then this is Lower Egypt. And I think a lot of times as youngsters or in elementary school, we look at a map and we assume that the Mediterranean Sea must drain into the Nile in this direction, but in reality, this is Upper Egypt, and the Nile flows in this direction out to the Mediterranean Sea. This is the king who was responsible for eventually uniting Upper and Lower Egypt. If you recall from our discussion about the ancient Sumerians, one of the problems that develops within the Sumerian culture is that they did divide themselves at one point, and as a result, they weakened themselves and were prone to outside attack. King Menes is the Egyptian king who will bring those two divided Egypts together. Let me direct you to this particular timeline here. And the thing that I need you to see, and again, anytime you need to take some additional notes, feel free to hit pause on this video, and then you will be able to watch this at your individual pace. I'm going to divide ancient Egypt into three time frames known as the kingdoms. There's the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. If we look at our original timeline and our earliest arrivals, you'll see in 3500 BCE, we have the very first settlers along the Nile River. 3200 BCE is when Egypt was divided, and then again there is where King Menes in 3100 BCE will unite them. I would direct you to this portion here on the Old Kingdom. This is one of those interesting things that is very unique to Egyptian history. In 2660 to 2200, somewhere in that particular time frame, there was not a lot of flooding that happened along the Nile River. As a matter of fact, at one particular time, there was no flooding. As a result, no flooding, no extended agriculture, no crops, which led to starvation, more crime, and yet the entire time taxes would increase. The Egyptians call that the first illness. You'll see by 2050 to 1800 BCE, when we see the Middle Kingdom, law and order is revived, and then there is more prosperity. The Egyptians then will refer to the second illness, and that it's an invasion by a group known as the Hyksos. We will be talking about the Hyksos at a later time, but just understand that Egypt was invaded by this outside group. I'll spend the rest of this lecture really talking about the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom, I think, has a lot of important elements that you and I generally can recognize from most of our studies of history, whether that be in elementary, middle school, or high school. One, I think you should recognize in the New Kingdom, the Egyptians felt a lot of humiliation as a result of their invasion from the Hyksos. And as a result, they developed new nationalism. That in turn will result in a brand new military, a very powerful military with new weaponries and large-scale standing armies. The New Kingdom was also the time of King Tutankhamun, most commonly known as King Tut, and I will talk about him in just a moment. It's also the time of the rule by a female pharaoh, and her name is Hatshepsut, and I'll show you her picture here momentarily. The other individual that I think is worth mentioning among many others is Ramses II. In that particular reign, you will see there's an incredible amount of monument building, and I will walk you through all of those. Let me talk about King Tut. I think what you need to know about King Tut is we know a lot about King Tut today, and he's been elevated quite often in history, but not really for the right reasons. Tut did become a ruler or pharaoh at age 9, and by age 17 he had been killed, and Egypt was already moving on with the new pharaoh. And so the question that should be asked is, well, he must have done something quite remarkable from age 9 to 17. In reality, King Tut didn't really do that much that was remarkable, but let me explain why he is significant. In the most ancient times, whether it was the Old Kingdom or the New Kingdom, when pharaohs died, they had elaborate ceremonies to celebrate their life and, of course, their death. And as you know, they were originally built, or they were placed, their bodies were placed into sarcophaguses and then placed into massive tombs, many times initially in pyramids, but then at a later time they were placed into caves. It didn't take very long for grave robbers to discover that these pharaohs, their tombs were left unguarded after a period of time, and they possessed great wealth. And so it almost became a new secondary career, if you will, to become a grave robber. By the time of Tut's death in the 1340s or 1330s, what you will discover is that they had wised up to the idea that people were breaking into these tombs. And the planners essentially planted several false chambers in front of Tut's tomb that were filled with wealthy objects. The first grave robbers were able to pretty much take everything and destroy everything. subsequent robbers discovered that it was an empty tomb, and then they went on their way. It was a British archaeologist by the name of Dr. Harold Carter in 1922 who, upon excavation of the Tutankhamun tomb, actually discovered the completely intact tomb all behind a wall. And it is because that it is the one and only. Here's an image of Dr. Howard Carter opening Tut's tomb in 1924. It is the only truly fully intact tomb of a pharaoh ever discovered. And what that really truly did was elevate Tut to a whole new level. If you were fortunate enough to see the Tut exhibit when it was in Denver, Colorado, the last couple of years, you know what I'm referring to. The other element I would mention, it's really an interesting object, is virtually everyone involved with the Tut excavation, including Dr. Carter, all died from interesting or mysterious deaths. One of the individuals was bitten by an unusual spider and died as a result of that spider bite. There were other strange or unusual accidents. And I think if you put all of that together, it did create this kind of notion that perhaps Tut's tomb was cursed, and those who would dare to breach the funeral or burial spot were recipients of that curse. I will let you make that decision if you believe that notion or not. Hatshepsut, which was the Egyptian female ruler or pharaoh, the very first one, please note she declared herself pharaoh, and she was known as a trade leader. She really changed the kind of whole mentality of Egypt at the time, is as it says here, she preferred economic stability to warfare. She ruled for an extended period of time, and she was a beloved leader. The only other individual, and by the way, there's another more, I would say, a beautiful image of the face mask of King Tut. The other, I think, noteworthy individual, because he really is fascinating for multiple reasons. Today, if you were to travel to Egypt, what you would find are great monuments that really are this kind of testimony to a different time of Egypt. What we can thank many of those artifacts for, or who we can thank for, is Ramses. Ramses II built an enormous amount of these images, as you would see here, as a compliment to himself. The other probably well-known idea about Ramses II is he ruled for 67 years, which was remarkable. And it has been documented he fathered over 150 children. And yes, I did say he fathered over 150 children. Yes, he was a very, very busy pharaoh. Let me go back to this slide here. I want you to there's a couple of things that I mentioned there. I want you to make note of this in your notes, please. In 1288 BCE, the Egyptians will meet a formidable force named the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, where they will fight to a standstill. Literally, neither side could go any further. Thousands of men were dying, and they finally agreed to a peace agreement. And then, if you can see here, they eventually become full-blown trading partners. If you look at some of the other items here, by 1200 BCE, Egypt once again is invaded by a new group known as the People of the Sea. In 671, the Assyrians will conquer Egypt, 500, Persians, and then in 332, Alexander the Great. We will be talking about the Persians and Alexander the Great in a later lecture. You can pause this slide at any time, and you can see some quotes that I have pulled from various sources of ancient Egypt. I think this is very interesting here, that Hatshepsut describes herself as exceedingly good to look upon. A beautiful maiden, fresh, serene of nature. She felt pretty good about describing herself. Here's two items you could appreciate maybe. They're comments about the importance of education in ancient Egypt, and also about the problems with beer. And I think that's something a lot of high school, or college students can appreciate. If you look at the Egyptian calendar, it was quite advanced for its time. Obviously, a lot of what they were doing was all centered around that flood plant harvest. Just a reminder, it flooded every June. The water receded generally in late September or October. That's when they began to plant, and they would harvest later in the spring. Egyptian mathematics was pretty elaborate for its time. If you can imagine the amount of information needed to do the elaborate engineering for the pyramids. The medicine, I would point out to you, is also fairly significant. The Egyptians would practice what you and I might describe today as homeopathic medicine, meaning that they found a lot of natural cures. They certainly, from what we believe in their writing, they knew how to cure headaches, basic cuts and things of that nature. They understood not about infections, but they certainly knew how to stop further infection if it was not too advanced. There are about 80 pyramids still standing today. If you can imagine the individual stones making up a lot of these pyramids here, some of the stones weigh 2.5 to 15 tons each. The largest pyramid today in Egypt is about 13 acres in size. That is larger, much larger than the PCC Fremont campus. Another image of a modern day pyramid still standing. Prepared this slide about Egyptian women. I do want you to kind of appreciate some of that contribution here. One, Egyptian national identity is derived from all people sharing a common relationship with the king. That means that's men and women. What we see in the Egyptian society, women enjoyed several new freedoms. They certainly could succeed the throne if they were in the royal family. Women could buy, sell, and own property, did not need male guidance or approval. Women could become government officials. You might find this a little distasteful in modern times, but marriage between a brother and sister was approved. We see that largely in the ruling classes. Most average, if you will, or common Egyptians would not do that. And women could enter into marriage and divorce contracts. Now, that will change over time, and women will lose several of those rights. The last part of this video that I want to share with you is just a little bit of Egyptian religion. And there are thousands and thousands of stories, just as there are dozens and dozens of various gods and goddesses and other entities that the Egyptians worship. But I want to tell you about a few of these that really kind of make a larger connection to understanding how the ancient Egyptians lived. One of the most famous stories is the story of Osiris and Isis. Osiris, the man, and Isis, his wife, are a married couple, and they really provide this mythological story of how Egyptian life began to evolve and how people began to live and exist. Some of you may have seen this symbol here. It's called the Ankh. It's very popular now. Some people have it in the form of tattoos. This really, for the Egyptians, is the symbol of life. Depending on which interpretation you like, some people also see it as the symbol of Osiris and Isis and the unity of heaven and earth. For some, it really is about power and dominance. And for Dr. Howard Carter, the man who found King Tut's tomb, he sees this as a primitive representation of female genitalia. I think what you'll find is most Egyptians or Egyptian scholars do believe it truly is the symbol of life. Here is the mythological story. Osiris and his brother, as brothers might occasionally do, they quarreled. His brother's name is Set, S-E-T-H, Set. Set and Osiris began to quarrel. Set will kill his brother Osiris and will chop his body up into small pieces and will scatter his brother's remains all through Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, if you wanted to know why Set would chop up his brother and scatter then his remains throughout Upper and Lower Egypt, understand what the Egyptians could comprehend and could relate to. A person who is dead could potentially come back to life. But they were smart enough to know if you were chopped up into little pieces, there is no way that you could be put back together and rejuvenated or regenerated. They believed that piece of it. Isis, being a good wife, went throughout Upper and Lower Egypt, according to this mythological tale, collected all of the pieces of her husband Osiris, and put him back together. Now that he was whole again, and because he had godlike powers, he automatically now was granted new life. Because he can no longer be a living entity like you and I, because he's been cut into small pieces, he now must go to the underworld, and he is now a god. And now Osiris has a new important task. He is the god who guides the underworld and sees something here, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, what we call the feather of justice. Here's what the Egyptian belief said. Upon your death, when you went to the underworld, your heart was removed from your body and was put on a feather scale. You can see here is a human heart, here is a feather. If your heart weighed more than the feather, your soul would be devoured by the crocodile-shaped eater of the dead, and you would not have immortality. If the feather weighed more, you were a worthy soul, and you were allowed to enter what they called the happy field of food, and you would have eternal life. What were you judged on? 3 areas. Sacrilege, meaning your religion and how well you observed it. Sexual perversion, and if you had abused your power against the weak. And that does not mean you have to be the king. You could simply be the bully of your neighborhood, and that would be seen as an abuse of your power. Now, hopefully, you are already seeing a significant problem. Take a moment and think what that problem might be in relationship to a human heart on a scale in comparison to a feather. You're right. The human heart will always weigh more than a single feather. Although you probably have never held a human heart, you can imagine that it does weigh more than a simple feather. That creates a problem for the ancient Egyptians, does it not? And this goes back to my conversation in earlier lectures about the potential for religion to become very distorted and manipulated, and where the masses truly can be deceived. For a small fee, a local priest or priestess would accept that fee, or would accept some additional grain or some other type of gift, and what they could assure you is their connection to Osiris. They would ensure that your loved one, their heart would not weigh more than the feather. And as a result, you could be assured that your loved one would be going to the happy field of food and have eternal life. I will tell you one final mythological story, and we will conclude our discussion of the ancient Egyptians. This is Amun-Ra. He is a sun god. If you can imagine, the Egyptians saw the sun come up every day, just like you and I do. You see it go across the sky, just as the ancient Egyptians did, and then the sun goes down in the horizon. You and I have a scientific understanding of how that might happen.